Hello and welcome to the Is It Just Me podcast with Jess and Luke. It's the podcast dedicated to your hot takes and unpopular opinions. We are live across YouTube and Twitter, so make sure you're getting involved throughout the show, and we could be featuring you as part of our, I want to say discussions, but this is definitely going to be a debate. So in case you haven't worked it out yet, I'm Jess, and over there is Luke, our resident reporter for F1 for Autosport. How you doing, Luke?
I'm doing good, thank you, Jess. A little apprehensive, nervous even about this week's podcast. I think it's a very, very spicy debate and topic that we're going to get stuck into. Really interested to see what takes people out there have as well, because I think everyone's got a view on it, and yeah, it's going to be interesting.
I am genuinely terrified about how this is going to go. I think we were saying before we came on air, like, I don't know if I've been more nervous about one of these podcasts than I am in this very moment. So, but before we get going, because I think everyone is kind of chomping at the bit to get going, I know I sort of am. We wanted to let you know about a quick competition that we're running over on Motorsport Tickets. And this has been launched to shine a light on those that have kept the wheels turning during these rather weird and difficult times. So each month, Motorsport Tickets are going to be giving away a pair of £250 gift vouchers for yourself and someone that you believe is super deserving of a prize like that. So all you need to do to be in a chance with winning a pair of vouchers is to simply head to @Motorsport Tickets on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Tag your hero in the comments under any of the Who From Your Crew posts that you'll find over there, and share the reason why you've nominated this person. And if your story is selected, you and your nominated hero will win 250 quid each to spend on motorsporttickets.com. I mean, obviously, it's there for you to spend on when we actually have events to go to, which fingers crossed will be soon. But if you want to find out more or read the full terms and conditions, then head to motorsporttickets.com/heroes, and good luck. Now, okay, I can't delay it anymore. We've got to dive in. We've got to rip off the Band-Aid for this one. Today's unpopular opinion came from the kickback that we saw on our previous video on the YouTube channel, which was part of the Greatest F1 Team series that we did. And it was looking at who we would put in as our number one driver slot. And it caused, is it safe to say, a little discussion on the old comment section, Luke?
Just a little discussion, yeah. They say you should never read the comments, but I've always been a big believer in that you've got to look at it no matter what, even if it's not pretty. And it caused a lot of debate. We across the Motorsport Network, our panel of F1 experts, I believe we had 18 all in all across the world. We voted for our number one driver for our greatest F1 team of all time, and we voted for Lewis Hamilton. He came out on top, and the podcast we did sort of discussed why we picked him ahead of Ayrton Senna, ahead of Michael Schumacher, who were second and third respectively. And but obviously that wasn't going to be the end of it. It then followed that people were discussing all about why was Hamilton picked, why it shouldn't have been him, why it should have been Senna or Schumacher or somebody else. And I think that's really sort of led us into this debate about defining who is the greatest F1 driver of all time, and is it even a debate that we should be having?
So we picked out, because there was one comment that stuck out to me, and I can already see this person is active in the chat and is very passionate about this subject. So Uzziah, we see you. And the comment that he posted on that video that we were talking about is, you cannot compare drivers from different generations. There is no GOAT. And I always love it when people leave spaces and full stops after every word. It really means that they feel passionately about the topic that they're talking about. So they're saying that basically this is a futile experiment. Don't know why you guys are even trying to say that there's a GOAT, because there's no way that we can ever know. But Luke, let's start off. Why are we obsessed with comparisons? And I'm not saying we as in like the Motorsport Network, but in general, it's something that we do quite a lot, right? It's quite a natural inclination to be like, who is the greatest of this area that ever was? And it's it's something in F1 that we talk about, or some people talk about quite a lot. Why do we make comparisons?
Well, I think we like things to be quite black and white. I think we always like it to be that you can say one person was better at something than another. So, I mean, in an F1 season, for example, you see Lewis Hamilton beats Valtteri Bottas. Therefore, you would say, okay, that means that Lewis Hamilton is a better driver than Valtteri Bottas. And I think, yeah, that does apply across sort of all sports, really. I mean, you look at football, I mean, the great sort of Lionel Messi versus Cristiano Ronaldo debate. Then you compare to older players, Diego Maradona, Pele, for example. And it sort of becomes this experiment and this sort of process that people go through, really trying to sort of define, well, what qualities did that person have over this one? What made them better than everybody else? And then you get even events where you try and compare that across sports, like where does Roger Federer compare to someone like Michael Jordan? And it's a really, really interesting, I think it's an interesting debate for people to have, just because there's so many different views that can come up. But then, yeah, when it comes to F1, obviously there's so many sort of different parameters, as we're going to come on to, that make it just that so much more harder. And I think it's something that in F1, yeah, we do talk about a lot, and we like to sort of look back on the great drivers who have graced this wonderful sport over the last 70 years and really given us so many amazing memories and so many amazing moments. And I think that it kind of does lead to the question, well, who stands out above the rest? Who were the real drivers that defined the sport and made it so incredible? And I think that's when we get down to debates such as this, and it is so hard for everybody to kind of come to one common answer and be like, yeah, I fully agree with that, because there's going to be so many caveats to it.
I think we're going to dive into them, as you say, but Uzziah is so passionate about this. He actually also sent us an audio clip to back up exactly why he thinks this, and he's going to open up the show debate for us right now. So let's hear from Uzziah.
The ongoing debate about who is the greatest driver in Formula One history is the most nonsensical, meaningless, and just ridiculous debate that there can be, because it makes absolutely no sense to compare a driver from the 1950s to a driver from the 1980s to a driver from the 2010s, because the cars have changed so much in the last 70 years. A car from the 1950s is completely different to a car from the 2000s or the 2010s, whatever decade you want to pull out. The cars are absolutely completely different. They bring completely different challenges, and it's stupid to say that, you know, Hamilton is the GOAT, or Schumacher is the GOAT, or Senna is the GOAT, or any of these drivers are the GOAT. It makes absolutely no sense to state any driver as the GOAT, because you have not seen any of these drivers head to head in exactly the same car in their primes. Like we've never seen Ayrton Senna and Lewis Hamilton in the same car in their primes. It's impossible for that, because unfortunately Ayrton is no longer with us, and Lewis, I'd argue, is getting on a little bit as well, you know. And we've never seen Schumacher and Fangio in the same car in their primes, because unfortunately Fangio is no longer with us, you know. And it's just, it doesn't make any sense to have a greatest driver ever, you know. It's just the most ridiculous, nonsensical debate ever. Like, let's all agree that, you know, we have the best driver of every generation. Like, in every generation there are a couple of drivers that stand out, you know. I'm sure we can all agree on that, you know. But greatest driver ever, I'm sorry, it's stupid. There will never be a greatest driver ever. Never. Like, that is not possible. It doesn't make any sense. So, and anyone who has, I honestly feel like anyone who has a certain driver who they feel is the greatest of all time, I feel like that's their bias speaking. Like, that's their favorite driver, so they're gonna say that's their you know, that's the greatest driver ever. I feel like they're only saying that someone is the greatest driver ever because they're a fan of that driver. But anyone impartial who understands the sport and who is, you know, educated on how the sport works will not have a greatest driver ever, because they know that it's a meaningless debate.
Yikes. Now, the one thing that we picked out from that Uzziah talks about is this idea of bias. And it's something that follows it follows everybody around, right? It follows, and when we first put this show together, Luke, we spoke about the ability to have an open and honest debate or communication without the feeling like you're going to be attacked. And I personally love debating about F1. I love the fact that there are differing opinions, but there is that kind of it's a word that's thrown around a lot, and I don't know if this is the correct word to use, but toxicity that kind of can follow debates in F1, especially around drivers, because there is a lot of tribalism in F1, isn't there? There's a lot of protection of certain drivers, or seemingly what some people might say a blindness to anything else other than my driver is the best, and that's it. But what do you think about labeling someone as the greatest and then that association with bias?
I think it's a very, very delicate debate. I think that there is always going to be a sort of generational, I don't know if bias is the right word, but certainly a generational weighting, let's say. And I think, as Uzair put in his audio clip there, it is impossible for us to say I witnessed Fangio, or in my case Senna or Gilles Villeneuve racing with my own eyes. Therefore, I cannot say for sure, okay, what that driver was as a driver 100%, apart from reading, apart from watching video clips, apart from talking to people. And that's kind of how you build up this sort of mental picture, I guess. So that is always going to be something that has to be taken into consideration. And again, with the survey that we did, we had journalists from a wider range of ages as well. So it is always a case of that you want to sort of cater for that as much as possible. And I think yeah, when it comes to the bias debate, I think that's something as a journalist. I mean, I've throughout my career, it's been a question that you always do have to sort of grapple with and get asked. And you need to be as fair as possible in absolutely everything that you do. I mean, that is the absolute number one golden rule as a journalist. You are fair, you are accurate, you are truthful. And I think in doing so, that leads, you do sort of look at the very good points and very bad points of all drivers, particularly when it comes to the debate such as this. But then it comes to a point where you maybe point out a bad element of a driver, and then because that's not agreed with, that then gets turned into, oh, well, you're biased against that driver. And I think that it's very important through all of this that we're very fair in a debate, but also that all sides are listened to, that you must be very understanding of where people are coming from, that you must be sort of appreciative of the good and the bad, because you can't be deaf to things that you just don't want to hear. If you wanted to make a case for Michael Schumacher being the greatest of all time, absolutely fine, and there is a very, very strong case for that. But then also you have to say, okay, but what about the bad elements? What about the clash with Damon Hill? What about the clash with Jacques Villeneuve? What about Monaco 2006 in qualifying? And I'm not saying those are reasons to say, okay, he's definitely not the greatest of all time and should be shunned from all the history books at all, no. But it has to be accounted for and it has to be understood. And I think that comes for all drivers. I think that comes for Lewis Hamilton as well. It is a case of that we all sort of went through, okay, what is the case against him as well? Why wouldn't he be number one? Same with that, and same with everybody. So, yeah, I think bias, it's a word that is thrown around. I think it shouldn't be used as an accusation against people because of an opinion that is not agreed with. I think it needs to be used with care, because it is a very, very loaded word, and I think it does need to sort of be understood and respected by all sides. But when it comes to a debate like this, I think it is very important that we do look at the whole picture and we don't just sort of look at one side, and that's something that we really did endeavour to do.
Sure. So let's take a look a bit at that bigger picture that you mentioned. So Isaiah also mentioned a bunch of reasons why we can't compare drivers across eras. So let's have a quick look into those points, I guess, to see, what it's all about, I guess. So they're saying that a big point, and we might just cut to an audio clip in a second, but obviously, Formula One is not just a sport that includes, or people are going to kill me for calling Formula One a sport, a series that is dependent on a singular person. It is man and machine, or woman and machine, right? You are reliant on your equipment, and that equipment can have a massive, great big effect on how successful you are as a driver. And that is just part and parcel of Formula One. It's one of the things that makes it brilliant, because we see so many technical advances, and obviously we love seeing those machines almost tamed and thrown around tracks as fast as possible with as much skill and flair as possible. I mean, that's why we're all Formula One fans at the end of the day. So, I mean, how would it even be possible to compare different eras of Formula One? If we were going to try, how would that even be possible?
It is very, very difficult, as you rightly say, because there are so many sort of varying differences between different eras of F1. And also that has a big impact on how drivers perform. I mean, for example, Sebastian Vettel was absolutely fantastic, four-time world champion in the era of regulations before the ones we've got now. And then with the V6 hybrids, just hasn't quite had that same kind of level of success. And that is because those sort of 2010 to 2013 cars, they suited his driving style so perfectly. And it was, a fantastic run of form. And absolutely in no way am I saying that is sort of a reason not to count him as one of the greats or anything like that. But it just shows how drivers can be very, very different across eras. And then obviously when you come to comparing the most recent drivers, such as Lewis Hamilton, compared to the very first F1 drivers like Fangio, that is when it becomes really, really, really difficult, because it's so hard to compare them like that. But I think that we can sort of find some common themes and common elements that go across these sort of eras and drivers. And I think a big one that we talked about in the Greatest F1 Team podcast was sportsmanship, for example, because that is something that no matter what, from the very, very first motor race to the present day, has been there right the way through. And that is something that you can very clearly sort of say that drivers either had or didn't have. And you can sort of look at their sort of etiquette on track and say very, very clearly whether one was cleaner or fairer than another, I believe. And I think that is sort of, we've got to look for elements like that, I think, when it comes to sort of finding the greatest and really trying to find who is better than someone else. And that was a big reason for why Lewis Hamilton was picked as the number one over Senna and Schumacher. And I think it is things like that, we look at. If you look at the record books, obviously it's much harder, because then you say, okay, well, Schumacher's got 91 race wins, but was his level of competition as competitive as Lewis Hamilton's, or did Lewis Hamilton have an easier time of it? You go back to the days of Senna and Prost, and you say, well, they didn't have as many races in a season as drivers do now, therefore they could never win as many races. And that reliability was obviously so much more of a problem as well for drivers back then as well. And then you go right the way back to the 50s, and it's like a 9-race season at points. And you're saying, again, well, okay, how can a driver be expected to get to 91 race wins if he's only got 9 races a season? All very true. So it is kind of this very difficult game, and I think a sort of puzzle you've got to put together when it comes to making this debate. But I think if you can find those topics, such as sportsmanship, where it is very, very easy, I think, for us to compare across eras, I think that is when you can really have a decisive factor as to who the all-time greatest is.
I'm interested to hear a bit more about the sportsmanship thing, because I guess a lot of the counter to that argument is that sportsmanship quantifiable, or is that quite a subjective analysis of a driver's skill? It's not something really that we can put a number on or measure. It's definitely something where we're like, well, you know, for instance, James Allison came out talking about Hamilton and how the difference between him and other world champions is that he's clean, he's squeaky clean. But is he squeaky clean? Because I guess there would be a lot of people that would say, especially in his early years, he wasn't. And obviously, again, that's another thing about our sport, is that we're lucky enough to see these drivers kind of grow and mature, and they go from the young, enthusiastic rookie through to the more seasoned. For some of them, they get more level-headed. Others maybe not. But how do we measure sportsmanship? I'm really interested to know your take on that.
It is very difficult, of course. And again, I think that for all drivers, you can pick out examples where they acted unsportingly. With Lewis, for example, I think about Australia 2009 when he was... the team said that he was encouraged by the McLaren team manager, Dave Ryan, to basically lie to the stewards, and that resulted in his disqualification and for Dave Ryan to leave the McLaren team. And I think that is an example of that. Perhaps with a bit more maturity, Lewis would have sort of switched on his head and gone, but hang on, this is wrong. I shouldn't be doing this. So I'm absolutely not saying that Lewis is squeaky clean. But then, you think about, okay, when Schumacher had the instance I mentioned, or Ayrton Senna driving into Alain Prost, Lewis has never done that. Like, he's never deliberately driven into another driver as retaliation or anything like that. And I think that's something that James Allison was very good at highlighting. James himself has worked across some, I think, the last 25 years in Formula One. He worked with Michael Schumacher at Ferrari, worked with Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes. So it's very, very easy for him, I think, to make that comparison between them. And yeah, it's maybe not quantifiable, but I think if this was all down to statistics, you'd say, okay, well, who's got the best win percentage ratio in F1 history, or who's got the most wins or scored the most points or whatever. But then that again has its issues, the points. I mean, I think all of the top 10 now are drivers racing today because it's now 25 points for a win instead of 10 points or 9 points as it was in the past. So it's really difficult. I think if you get too sort of bogged down in statistics, I think that's going to narrow the window very, very much. So I think when it comes to sportsmanship, that is always going to be quite subjective, of course, but I think you can certainly pick out incidents that really did define a driver's sportsmanship, and I think that was very clear with Schumacher. I think that was a big reason why Schumacher wasn't nominated as our number one pick. And I think when it comes to Lewis Hamilton, I think there are very, very few that you can pick out, and none quite to the severity of Schumacher or Senna.
Yeah. I mean, again, all valid points. I mean, you raised the points of stats and not getting too bogged down, but actually, when we were going through them before this pod, there are still some really interesting findings, because, as you said, win ratios are based on how many races they competed in, and then how many and where they finished, and that is, I guess, you touched on it before. Reliability comes into effect, really, especially when we're talking about the earlier races and the 50s and 60s. But if we look at the win ratios, they're very high in favor of the older eras, and obviously, again, that is because there are fewer races for us to be taking into account. But let's just because I was super interested when we went through these stats. So currently, we've taken the top 5, haven't we? So at the top is Juan Manuel Fangio, who a lot of people list as the greatest of all time, just based on the fact that F1 in that era was just, well, it was brand new, but it was also hugely untamable, wildly dangerous, and he pulled far and above anybody else that was racing at that time. So his win ratio is 46.15%, which is, winning nearly half the races of your career. Pretty solid effort there. Next up, we have Jim Clark, which was another driver that a lot of people were vocal about in the comments on our Greatest F1 Teams video, saying, he didn't even get a mention. How can you not mention Jim Clark? And he's second in that ratio, and he's got 34.25%, followed by Ascari with 39.39%. So again, like, all really... Oh, actually, I've got that the wrong way around, haven't I then? Is that correct? Have I written my numbers down wrong?
Wrong way around, yeah. Ascari should be above Clark.
Ascari is above Clark. That was my writing down issue there. Sorry for that, guys. But the top 3, are retro greats, if we want to give them a kind of all-encompassing title. Next up is Lewis Hamilton with a 33.6% win ratio. And then straight after him, there's Schumacher with a 29.55%. But as you pointed out before we went on air, if Schumacher hadn't have returned to Formula One for the second time, his win ratio would have been 36.55%. So he would still be above Hamilton. And obviously, when we're talking about Schumacher's records, because he holds quite a few of them, in case you hadn't noticed, obviously the main talking point, especially going into this season, was whether Lewis was going to essentially overtake him on that win ratio. So do records make the greatest? I think I already know what you're going to say, but I feel like just to round this section off, we should probably cover that.
No, they don't. I think that they're a good indicator. Obviously, I think the win ratio, especially, I think that's a really, really good way to sort of compare drivers across eras. But it doesn't define the driver. I mean, okay, so Michael's win ratio, for example, that dipped by a long way because of his comeback, but because he had all that success with Ferrari and then called it quits, and then came back with Mercedes and had those extra 3 years. Does that make him any less of an all-time great? I really don't think so at all. I mean, he still is one of the greatest of all time. We know that when he was racing with Mercedes through those final 3 years, that was not a car that could be winning week in, week out. I think the fact he didn't beat Rosberg in any of those 3 years, I think that does maybe sort of lead to some questions like, okay, well, did he still have it? Was he still quite as sharp as he was before? But it doesn't make him any less of a great. Like, he's still statistically the greatest of all time right now. He's still, for me, in the top 2 greatest of all time drivers for me. But it's so difficult, and I don't think you can go with the statistic books and say, look, this is by far our number 1 or number 2, because again, you look at the world champions list. There are so many great drivers who were never world champions: Sterling Moss, Gilles Villeneuve. Those names, they're up there with some of the greats we've seen in F1. But just because they've not won a championship doesn't mean, oh, well, let's forget about them. So no, I think we've got to be careful when it comes to the stats.
Well, let's take a listen to Josh, who also submitted a bit of audio, because he has a slightly different opinion.
I believe it is possible to compare F1 drivers from different eras, because although drivers from different eras drive very different machinery, all racing drivers throughout history are united in their desire for success and ultimate glory. Therefore, we can compare their relative successes and compare the circumstances under which they achieve that success. Comparisons allow us to appreciate the fastest drivers that are on the grid today, just as to help new fans of F1 discover the legends of old. For example, when people compare Hamilton to Senna and Fangio, fans are reminded or educated for the first time on the achievements and flair of previous champions such as Senna and Fangio, and a whole new generation can discover them. Comparisons to modern legends contextualise the achievements of those previous greats. At the end of the day, debating, aside from the torrent of Twitter abuse I get whenever I call Alain Prost the greatest racing driver of all time, debating is such a huge part of the sport that it would be a crying shame to deny us or invalidate such a fundamental, long-lasting cornerstone of F1 fan culture.
So what Josh is saying there is that it's part and parcel of being in Formula One to be trying to find the greatest racer, and that it actually allows us to maybe put more of a spotlight on those racers that have been before and have done amazing things in trying to, I guess, understand their successes in relation to the modern day F1, which I guess is usually what we're trying to do, right? It's about going, okay, here we are. We're watching 20 Formula One drivers currently racing. You often obviously see a lot of the former F1 drivers still in the paddock, either associated with teams or management, or they're working with the FIA in some capacity. And it allows us to kind of go, well, here's who currently on track right now is doing pretty well or is great. But don't forget that we've also had all these greats that have come before, and then trying to, I guess, understand in relation to each other what that success meant to Formula One.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think it is the case of that these drivers really made F1 what it is today, and it's their success that made it such an interesting sport. And you do have these sort of standout names through F1 history because they changed the sport. They really, really did. And I think Josh makes a great point about sort of it being a way for us to look back on F1 history, to learn more and sort of get a better understanding of what the sport used to be like. And I mean, I think of, for example, when Michael Schumacher, I believe it's when he matched Ayrton Senna's, it was either his pole record or his win record. And he was informed of that in a press conference. He had no idea, and he broke down in tears. He started crying because that was what it meant to him, that Senna, this great driver, this man he looked up to, and he raced against briefly during his career as well, he had got to his level. And that was a real sort of mind-blowing moment for Schumacher. And again, you sort of say that when Vettel won his third title, or Hamilton won his third title, you say, okay, they're matched. Senna, they're much louder. And these are great names that bring back so many great memories, and you really think, wow, they were really, really good. Therefore, these guys have got to be seriously, seriously good as well. And I think it's so important that we do look back on the previous successes of drivers, regardless of the era. And I think really use that as a yardstick for the modern day drivers, because they want to look up to these drivers. They want to have that same kind of lasting impact on the sport that we all can, that they all can. And I think it's really, really important they do that. I think Josh, really interesting point he raised there as well, saying that for him, Alain Prost is the greatest of all time. And again, that I think, and I mentioned this to you before the show, it maybe comes sort of down to that subjective level of, well, what do you prefer in your driver? Do you like a driver like Prost, who sort of was nicknamed the professor, of course? He's very sort of calculated, very, very clinical. Or someone like Senna, who was sort of maybe more raw, maybe more passionate in terms of his driving style. So I think it's a really interesting debate. And I think, yeah, it's such a part of F1 culture now, and that fan culture, saying, well, X is better than Y because, and here are my reasons for it. I think if we just said, well, it's pointless us debating it, let's just not bother, I think that would rob us of so many sort of great talking points and a really good way to sort of talk things through.
Chris Hammersley sent us an email, so it wasn't a voice note, unfortunately, but I can read out what he said, because I thought he brought up another kind of linked to that, and it kind of, there just seem to be the same themes that are popping up. Obviously, I think it's just the intrinsic nature of Formula One. But Chris said, interesting topic. I feel you can never create a perfect unbiased ruling because the goalposts have changed over the years. So obviously we've got more races, different points, different tracks, all points that we've brought up in the show so far. That being said, I feel you can compare the attributes of drivers, like who you think goes for gaps in races, who you think has had better starts, which driver is better in the wet. I mean, wet weather driving is something that we also nodded to in terms of allocating our like who are the F1 greats. All of them have been brilliant wet weather drivers, which delivers moments that you can never forget. So I guess like cultural impact, which again was a similar thing that we spoke about on the greatest F1 teams. And he says that's why you get people comparing Lewis to Senna and Kimi to Hunt. You can compare what makes different drivers great over different eras, but you'll never be able to factually prove it. So there will always be an element of bias. Again, that bias word coming up, the ability for us to objectively even stand back and go, okay, well, this is what this makes this driver great. This is what makes this driver great, and how do we then stack one on top of the other? But I think the other interesting thing there's been raised here as well is I mean, is it just the intrinsic problem of Formula One? I mean, can we even compare the drivers that are on the current grid? Because they're all in different cars. They're all, sometimes people argue, well, we never got to see the full greatness of Alonso or the full greatness of Vettel because of the machinery that they were given or that they had to deal with. And luck in that area is a big factor. And obviously we discussed this in previous podcasts, both on the Vettel podcast and on the Alonso podcast from last week. And I think, I forget who said it, but it was genuinely a quote that stuck with me. The best drivers get the best cars, but the great drivers keep them. But is the fact that F1 isn't a spec series anyway, is that should we just throw any kind of comparison of any drivers out the window?
It makes it hard, doesn't it? And it genuinely does. Like, unless you put everybody in exactly the same car, only then would you be able to say, okay, well, this driver is better than another. But then it comes into other aspects. I mean, IndyCar, for example, that's a spec series to all intents and purposes. But then the big teams always win. Like, you've still got the Penske's, the Ganassi's leading the way, because operationally those teams are better and stronger. And therefore you might say, well, okay, well, therefore our drivers with them always going to do better than drivers who are with a smaller team, even though it's the same car. So even a spec series might not fix it. Like, it's so hard to say. And I think that does make it really difficult, because you say, well, when was a driver at their absolute peak? When were they in the best sort of shape of their career? And did they have the opportunity during those years to really show that? I mean, for all we know, and I think he probably would say this himself, Fernando Alonso might have been the absolute best he ever was in his final 3 years with McLaren. But because that car was so poor, he couldn't properly show that. So it's a case of, well, okay, well, how do you prove that? And ultimately you can't. So it's kind of like a never-ending debate, really, as to where a driver was at that peak. Did they have the right tools available to them? But yeah, that quote you said, I think that it's so true, that these drivers, the Lewis Hamiltons, and he's won a race in every single season he's competed in. Like, I find that mind-blowing. Like, no matter what the car he's had, and he's had some bad cars. Like, anyone who says he's had great cars all the way through his career, that is not true. He has had a good car, good enough to win a race every single time. And yeah, that to me, like, that is what makes me really go, wow, okay. Again, Jim Clark's records, all with one team, like that, all with Lotus. That's incredible, I think. And you find these little sort of nuggets through F1 history, and it really makes you go, wow, like, I can't believe they actually did that with that team. Yeah, I think it's things like that really stand out.
And I'm seeing a lot in the chat because basically I'm going to try and find a solution, right? Because I just want everyone to be happy. I want everyone to feel good and to have it both ways and still have greatest, but also not get up in arms about the fact that you're trying to put one driver over another.
Okay.
And I'm seeing this, I was seeing this suggested throughout the show. And essentially what they're saying is, the debate's never going to be settled. We'll never have a singular GOAT. So why don't we just decide who the GOAT of every era was? And then just have a collection of like a hall of fame of Formula One drivers, which I guess we do have. But to have that kind of put the whole greatest of all time to bed and just have every era the best driver of that era.
I think that's a fair shout. Yeah, I think it is. I think it will. It will maybe sort of stop the debate short, but I've just googled a group of goats is called a tribe or a trip, apparently. So we could maybe call them that. I don't know. But...
Yeah, we were talking about tribes before and how tribal F1 is anyway. So maybe we can say we'll just have a tribe of goats. Yeah, let's just do that. That sounds good.
But I think it is. Yeah, that is a good way to look at it. I think you can. And I touched on this before the show, you can sort of look back, I think, through maybe even each decade and say, okay, that was the standout driver. 2010s, Lewis Hamilton, 2000s, Schumacher, 90s, Senna, 80s, Prost, 70s, Lauda, 60s, Clark, 50s, Fangio. Something like that. But even in those, you would have people say, oh, no, I don't agree with that one, or I'm not sure. And I think, yeah, when it comes to the GOAT debate, I don't think you're ever going to get one driver who is absolutely head and shoulders mind-blowingly above the rest, because these names we've talked about are all incredible drivers, incredible athletes, and have all proven themselves in this sport. And I think that deserves a lot of recognition. Obviously, I think that if we just said, okay, well, these are sort of the collective GOATs of each era, fine, great. But I don't think that's ever going to stop F1 fans from having that extra. Well, what if we did have Lewis in his prime versus Senna in his prime? How would that have gone? And I think debates like that, I think it's really imaginative, and I think that's really cool. Like, that gives a lot of enthusiasm to I think us to engage with people and chat with people and really have these debates. I think it's I think it's really, really important.
I'm seeing like Isaiah's back in the chat. Hello, thanks for being so active. Genuinely, you've started such a good debate on this, and I'm really enjoying it. He's saying the debate will still destroy keyboards, Jess, and I think he's probably right. Yes. Who else we said? I've got Formula One fan here that says problem is you will still have arguments, as people will say Lewis for this decade, and others will say Max or Alonso. So you know, I guess this is the whole. It's what I love and also dislike about Formula One is that we are almost spoilt with talent because we only have 20 drivers every season. And therefore we have a pool of, I mean, we've had obviously hundreds of Formula One drivers throughout history, but kind of a pool of that's relatively small in comparison to maybe, I don't know, and people might disagree with me for saying this, but, you know, with like footballers, there are way more footballers than there are Formula One drivers, and it allows us to kind of we always have to have the absolute best. I mean, Pastor Maldonado, absolute goat. Like, I can't believe he wasn't on our list. People are goading me to talk about Bottas. I mean, if he beats Lewis Hamilton, maybe if he beats Lewis Hamilton, then I'm going to have to concede that he's the goat, because, you know, that's what being beaten by a teammate is another deciding factor in whether you're a GOAT or not. And Formula One fans just saying, they've mentioned, obviously, yes, we do have paid drivers in Formula One. It's something that happens. But, you know, even then, we still have a rather large talent pool to choose from. So is it just futile? Should we just should we just turn up every week and go, 20 brilliant F1 drivers, and one of them will be a champion this year, and we don't need to compare. That's it.
No.
Should we do that?
No. Because life is not like that, Jess. It's a horrible world out there. It's brutal. It's savage. It's not all roses and rainbows and sunshine. And no, I think it's important. I think it really is important that we do have these debates and have these chats, because it's nice. Like, we don't want to all agree. We don't all want to have the same viewpoint on something, because I think that way we kind of just all gets a bit boring, doesn't it? I think we want to be able to say, look, this driver for me is my greatest because this is and make your argument, and then someone can counter that, as has been happening in the last few days, saying, okay, no, I don't think this person is the greatest because X, Y, Z. And that, I think that is just a really great part of sports, like sports culture, not just F1, is that you see these drivers, these athletes putting on these amazing shows of technical ability and sporting ability. That is entertaining in itself, but then it's all the other sort of offshoots that come from it, the debates about what they're doing and everything behind it, the lengths that they go to, the politics involved as well. That really, I think that makes, I mean, personally speaking, my job as a journalist so wonderful, because you've got so much more to dig into apart from, oh, this person won a race because they finished first. Because that's a really basic way to look at it. And I think that we do need to sort of have these debates, and I think just it's a good way to respect the history of the sport and respect the drivers who have come before and achieved such brilliant feats, but also really, I guess, sort of put into context the achievements of the modern day drivers and what they can do moving forward. And I think that's a really cool thing. So I think it is important that we do continue to have these debates, even if, as Uzair says, many a keyboard is going to be broken, many a podcast microphone is going to be shouted into, and we're never going to get to the end of this, I don't think. But long may that continue, I say.
And we don't always see eye to eye, especially not on this podcast, but we can still be amicable at the end of the day. I think that is, you've hit the nail on the head. And it's kind of what we said at the top of the show. It's brilliant to debate about Formula One. It's brilliant to have drivers that you will back through thick and thin, because Formula One is such a tumultuous sport. There's so much that goes on. I mean, as we've seen kind of over the past few weeks, even in other series like Formula E, sometimes your time in Formula One or Formula E can be fleeting. But you've got the ability for us to be able to have conversations as a community and to still enjoy it at the end of the day, even if you want to tear your hair out because someone is trying to tell you that Hamilton is better than Schumacher and you're either one of their passionate fans, that we are doing it in a respectful manner. I think that's the thing. Like, it's not cool to see spitefulness or hate against another person just because you don't agree with who they've selected as their greatest driver or their favorite driver or whatever. Like, it's fine to not agree. It's totally cool to not agree. I don't agree with a lot of people. But it's just about having that level of respect to have an open conversation with each other and to kind of try and see each other's viewpoints. Unless someone is being super toxic and horrid, and then that's when I just hit that block button and I'm like, we can't have a discussion, so I'm not going to talk to you anymore. But I think, to be honest, we're just going to, as usual with these debates, we just agree to disagree. I think I'm going to say I am in favour of this greatest of every era idea.
Okay, interesting. I will counter that and say no. We should say there is a greatest of all time.
Well, there we go. What do you guys think? You need to let us know. As always, do you agree with me? Do you agree with Luke? Do you disagree with both of us? That's what this show's all about. That's all for today. We will be back next week, so make sure you look out for next week's topic to get involved with the show, as Uzziah and Chris and Josh did on this week's show. If you've got ideas for next week's show, then we have a new email address that you can send us ideas through to. It's isitjustme@motorsport.com. That's isitjustme, written out lowercase, @motorsport.com. Send us your ideas, send us your hot takes, as well as doing that across social media, because we're active across there. Send Luke and I a DM, message us, tweet us, whatever you want to do, because this show is built around your hot takes, so we can't do it without you. If you're listening on audio platforms, make sure you give us a rating and subscribe. If you're watching us on YouTube for the first time, subscribe. If you are watching on Periscope on Twitter, give us a like, share, let somebody else know about it, because that's how this community comes together. Thanks ever so much for joining us. It's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from Luke.
And goodbye from me.